Hey, what's up guys? This is the long anticipated continuation of the syntax unit in my Linguistics 101 video series. And I just want to say right up front that this video is going to get pretty deep, like inception deep. We're going to be using phrases within phrases within phrases within phrases, and we're going to be talking about some pretty abstract concepts. So like inception, you might have to watch this video 2 or 3 times before you really start to grasp what's going on in here. And that's okay, because we're dealing with some pretty advanced concepts. As usual, I am very open and happy to take any and all questions, comments, concerns, anything that's confusing, anything that doesn't make sense, anything that I could say more clearly. Please let me know, because I'm here to help you guys learn more about languages and linguistics, and that's what I love to do. So in this video, we're going to be building off some of the stuff that we already talked about in the last section of this series. We talked about syntax trees and constituents, and I'm going to be showing you why that view of syntax is a little bit more surface level, and we need a little bit more of a complex perspective if we're going to be talking about some of the really interesting stuff that happens in syntax. Before I go any further about syntax, I need to talk about generative grammar, which is going to help us understand why we care about some of the abstract concepts that I'm going to bring up in this video. So generative grammar isn't the only way of looking at syntax, but it is one of the dominant schools of thought within the field, as far as I can tell, and that's the perspective that I'm going to take in this video. So the underlying thesis of generative grammar, according to my undergrad syntax book, is that sentences are generated by a subconscious set of procedures, like computer programs. These procedures are part of our minds, or of our cognitive abilities, if you prefer. The goal of syntactic theory is to model these procedures. In other words, we're trying to figure out what we subconsciously know about the syntax of our language. In generative grammar, the means for modeling these procedures is through a set of formal grammatical rules. So that's the definition of generative grammar that I'm giving you. You can come back to that definition if you need to. But for now, we're going to move on. What does that mean? When we describe the syntax of a given language, any language, pick your language. When we describe the syntax of that language, we want to define a set of rules that is capable of generating all grammatically acceptable sentences in that language, as long as you follow those rules. This set of rules should also not produce any ungrammatical sentences, as long as you stick to the rules. For example, if we're coming up with a set of rules about the English language, those rules should be able to produce a grammatical sentence like an angry dog bit a man. They should definitely be able to produce that sentence. And it should definitely not be able to produce sentences like a dog angry, a man bit. You should only be able to arrive at that sentence by violating some of the rules that you're proposing. Hopefully I haven't lost any of you guys so far. Basically, there's a short period of time between the moment that you decide you want to communicate a concept and the moment that you actually formulate a grammatical sentence in your brain. And that amount of time is usually very short, but you go through a series of processes during that time. And I'm going to give you an example of that right now. We're going to go through some of these processes using the example sentence from the previous slide, an angry dog bit a man. So when you first come up with an idea in your head that you want to communicate using words, it doesn't start off as a complete, well-formed sentence. It starts off as a series of ideas and concepts sort of floating in your head. So let's assume that you just read about, or you just heard about, or you just witnessed an angry dog that bit a man, and you want to tell someone about it. In order to generate a sentence on that subject, you would basically start off with these 4 simple concepts that I have listed here floating around in their little bubbles. Now, the information I have listed here doesn't tell us if the dog bit the man or if the man bit the dog, and it doesn't tell us anything about who's angry. It really doesn't tell us much about anything at all. But fortunately, you actually have more information on the subject in your brain than I have listed here on the page. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you want to communicate an idea like this, you already have more information than the 4 bubbles on the previous slide. You already know how these 4 words are related to each other. It's like each of the 4 words has a little metadata tag that tells you why the concept is relevant and how it relates to the other concepts that you're about to include in the sentence that you're forming. So at this point, we're still dealing with some basic ideas that are just bouncing around in your head. So we don't have anything that's really meaningful, and it's definitely not anything resembling a sentence yet. But we do have a basis to go off of now in order to start applying some rules that will allow us to put these pieces together and generate an actual sentence. So the next step is just to start applying some of these rules. For example, the rule that in English, adjectives go before the noun. Now we don't just have anger and dog as 2 separate constituents, but they're one bigger constituent, the angry dog. Now we start applying a few more rules to get the structure of the sentence, like the direct object goes after the verb, and the subject of the sentence goes before the verb. So now we're getting closer to something that resembles a little bit more an actual sentence in English. We have the basic word order of English. We still don't have a grammatical sentence, but we have transformed some of those metadata tags that were unspoken parts of the words floating around in your head, and we've turned them into a word order that is meaningful, and it's actually important and gives us important information. And now we conjugate our verb for person, tense, and number. And then we add in our articles, and we're left with a grammatical sentence in English. So that's a really quick introduction to what I'm talking about when I say we're going to look at syntax through the lens of generative grammar. That example was a bit sloppy and not very technical. I grossly oversimplified it, but it's a heuristic that should help you at least grasp the concept that we're trying to understand how grammar can be used to help us generate sentences. So let's go back to the issue that I raised in the first slide. We have these simple, flat trees that kind of fall short on their ability to help us show how sentences are generated. So take a look at these example sentences. The governor of California from Austria. The student of linguistics from Wisconsin. The book of poems with the red cover. These are not particularly interesting sentences. There's nothing crazy about them. But take a look at the simple syntax trees below that correspond to the sentences above. They should look pretty familiar if you've seen the last video. Those triangles underneath the prepositional phrases are just a shorthand that I use to show that I've condensed the whole phrase down into a single node. It's not really necessary, but it just makes it easier than drawing out every single branch on the tree, and it makes it a lot easier to fit them on a single page. But if that confuses you, just imagine that I drew out the whole prepositional phrase. Now, importantly, these trees don't do a very good job of expressing all the grammatical nuance involved in the 3 phrases at the top of the slide. And it's not obvious at first, but something funny is going on in the hierarchy a little bit deeper that these basic trees are not able to convey. And it becomes more apparent when we switch the prepositional phrases around, which normally you're allowed to do. But in these examples, it makes the whole phrase completely ungrammatical. So we take something like the governor of California from Austria. If you change it to the governor from Austria of California, that's bizarre. The student from Wisconsin of linguistics, the book with the red cover of poems, it just doesn't work that way. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot about prepositional phrases in this video, and just a really quick reminder, prepositions are those little words like in, on, with, of, for, from, at, stuff like that. And the prepositional phrase is the preposition itself along with the following noun phrase or whatever phrase comes after it. Maybe do a quick Google search or something if you're still a little bit shaky on that, because it's going to be an important concept for the rest of the video. Now I'm going to pose a question which will be the central question that we're going to try to answer for the rest of this video. Why is it that we can switch the order of some prepositional phrases but not the ones that I listed in the previous slides? And just a really quick disclaimer. We're going to be talking about prepositional phrases a lot in this video, and I'm not going to pronounce the whole thing every time, so I'm going to be referring to them as PPs. So get all the laughs out now. Now, like I said, normally you can get away with switching the order of the PPs in the sentence with no negative consequences. The sentence will still make sense. For example, you could say, the king in France without a head liked cake. Or you could say, the king without a head in France liked cake. I switched the order of the PPs, but it doesn't change the meaning, and it's still grammatical. The issue only comes up when you're dealing with PPs of two different types that give you two different types of information. So for example, if you say, the king without a head of France, now we run into an issue. It has to be the king of France without a head. And now that we're talking about the king of France rather than the king in France, all of a sudden the order of the PPs is actually important. So let's talk about these two different types of PPs. And actually, it's not even the type of PP that's important. It's the relationship between the PP and the noun. So let's take a look. Being the king of something is very different than being the king in a place. Being in a place is not necessarily essential or even related to being a king. Being the king of something actually is a requirement for being a king in the first place. It's an essential part of what it means to be a king. Okay, so being a king implies that you're the king of something. It begs the question, what are you the king of? Of PPs are required to be the closest PP to the noun that they're attached to. This type of phrase is called a complement, and it's not only limited to PPs. A complement could be a noun phrase or a verb phrase or a bunch of other things, but in this video, most of the examples we use are going to have PPs as the complement. So, going back to my example sentence from a few slides ago about the governor of California from Austria, when you say that he's from Austria, you're not really giving me any essential information about him being the governor. You're just giving me a little bit of additional information about the man himself. We call this an adjunct, and that's going to be an important term to remember for later. When you say that he's of California, which is a strange way of putting it, and we'll talk about that later too. But when you say that he's of California, you're actually giving me important information that is intimately linked to him being the governor. It's kind of answering the question, what is he governor of? And it complements that whole thought, that thought of him being the governor. So that's why we call it a complement. It completes the thought. And that brings us all the way around again, full circle, back to the original issue that I brought up, which is why these flat trees, these basic, simple syntax trees, aren't enough to really teach us a whole lot about what's going on deep in the underlayers of syntax. The problem with these flat trees is that they can't show us all the levels of the hierarchy. So if you look at the example to the right, you might be tempted to think that we're talking about a queen with the two following properties. Number one, she's of Naboo. Strange way of putting that again. We'll talk about that later. Number one, she's of Naboo. And two, she's on Tatooine. But that's actually a pretty simplistic way of thinking about it, because actually we're talking about a queen of Naboo with the following property. She is on Tatooine. Okay, so we're starting to see a separation and different levels of the hierarchy there. And notice how it even sounds so much more normal for me to say the queen is on Tatooine than it does to say the queen is of Naboo. Because those two phrases, the queen and of Naboo, are so closely related that you can't even put the verb is between them. So that's why we're positing X-bar theory, which gives us an intermediate level, the X-bar, in between some of these levels of the hierarchy. So if you look at the X-bar tree on the right, you can see why the other tree is called a flat tree, because it is flat. Everything's on the same level, and it doesn't give you that extra level of depth in the hierarchy. The X-bar tree gives us that extra depth. It gives us that intermediate node that's marked with the N and an apostrophe. We call it an N-bar because it's part of a noun phrase, but you could use it in any other type of phrase too. So you could have P bars, V bars, adjective bars. I'm from Wisconsin. We have all kinds of bars. And that's why it's called X-bar theory. X could stand for anything, just like in algebra. And if you look at the X-bar tree for a moment, it's important to note that there are no actual words listed at the N-bar level of the tree, just like there's no words listed at the phrase level. It's an abstraction that we use to group together words that are lower in the tree and to separate them from other levels that we need to distinguish them from. And since we don't actually pronounce anything at this bar level, it might be kind of tempting to view it as imaginary, but it's there, and it's an important tool that we need to help us analyze the syntax of our sentences. For example, in the X-bar tree to the right, we can clearly see that on Tatooine doesn't just describe the queen. It describes the Queen of Naboo, which is all contained under the N-bar node. This is going to help us see an important difference between the complement and the adjunct. And again, in this example, the complement is of Naboo, and the adjunct is on Tatooine. Now here is basically the same tree, but I've just added the article the. And the word the covers over the entire noun phrase, Queen of Naboo on Tatooine, rather than just over queen. And you can see that in order to do this, I had to add another N-bar node to the tree. That's because X-bar trees don't allow you to have more than 2 daughter nodes coming out of the same single mother node. That's how the hierarchy works. And I don't remember if I talked about this in my last video or not, but the intersection points between 2 branches on the tree, the ones in this tree that are labeled in blue, those are your nodes. And if you remember me talking about constituents from the last video, that's what nodes represent. Now remember that the complement, or that little essential bit of information that communicates what she's queen of, in this example it's the prepositional phrase of Naboo, the complement is the sister node to the head node. The head in this example being the queen, the noun because it's the central portion of the noun phrase. These 2 nodes are sisters, so they're on the same level of the hierarchy. And the adjunct on Tatooine, which is just additional information about her, is sister to the N-bar, which covers over the head and the complement. That's because the adjunct modifies the entire N-bar phrase, while the complement just modifies the noun. Now, I've been referring to the complement as an essential bit of information, and I don't want to confuse you about that, because you might already be thinking, well, hey, the complement in this example doesn't seem to really be necessary. You could say the sentence without it. And you're right. You could just say the phrase, the queen on Tatooine. And that's a totally grammatical phrase. But remember, the prepositional phrase on Tatooine fails to answer that question about the queen. What is she queen of? So, even if you were going to omit the complement, which is perfectly fine, you would still draw your tree with a space for the complement, and the adjunct would still be up there 1 level higher, sister to the N-bar, because the prepositional phrase on Tatooine doesn't answer that essential question, what is she queen of? So this is the answer to the question that I originally asked about 10 slides ago. Why is it that we can't switch the order of some of these PPs, specifically PPs that use the preposition of, usually? Hopefully by now you can answer that question for yourself. It's simply because the PP on Tatooine is not a complement, and it cannot fill that complement spot. We can add as many adjuncts as we want, and their order is totally flexible. So you could say, the Queen of Naboo, on Tatooine, on the ship, in disguise, in distress at her wit's end, with a huge wardrobe in front of R2-D2. And that's totally fine. And you can switch the order of any of those prepositional phrases, any of those adjuncts, but none of them can ever be moved to the spot reserved for the complement. So basically that's a really long explanation for a simple example on why X-bar trees are so much more useful than our old flat trees, and why we're positing those intermediate bar nodes and how that helps us analyze our sentences better. One final note before I go is that in this video we've mainly been dealing with PPs that are complements, but as you can see in these other examples, you can also have nouns that are complements to verbs. That's what we call a direct object. Or you can have verb phrases that are complements to other verbs or tenses. It gets way more complicated than that, but this is the 101 video, so I've simplified a lot and I've left out some information, but I'm going to cut it off here and allow you to digest all that until the next syntax video. If you want to learn more about this subject, I would highly recommend the excellent book by Steven Pinker called The Language Instinct. He talks about a ton of stuff in this book, but it's all interesting for people that are interested in languages or linguistics. Chapter 4, I believe, specifically talks about syntax and X-bar theory and adjuncts and complements, but it's really easy to read. Easy to understand, so he does a much better job of this than I do. Again, I do try to answer every single question that's left on my videos, so feel free to ask away. If you liked this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want more videos like this, be sure to subscribe, because I release at least 2 new videos every week designed for people that are learning languages. I'm also on Twitter and on Instagram, where I share more information on languages and linguistics, and you can interact with me there. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.